Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Amazing how quickly that week passed. And we're moving very slowly onto our departure to live in a Scottish castle. Well, in Scotland. Getting closer to it. And this is called Durban 1971 Part 5. They were peaceful days. I loved the constancy of the routine, looking forward to weekends, when friends came around for a Saturday afternoon braai, each pair contributing their own meat, and one a salad, another a pudding. So I didn't have to do anything other than provide plenty of ice in a cool box for the cans of beer to chill in. If Fred managed to get a Saturday off, usually once a month, we drove up to the farm. Fred and I fished, and we both joined in Dad's excitement as we watched his big project develop. He had paid a contractor to build a dam wall and a spillway across the biggest lower vlei to form a 200-acre lake. I was sad to lose that vast vlei, especially after Grandpa had ploughed up the middle vlei back at the beginning of the century to plant mealies out of reach of our 80-strong troop of baboons. It had been a necessity then to be a successful farming settler, to feed his cattle during the harsh winter months, or give up, as the rest of the place wasn't arable, just bush and mountains. However, we still have 4 other large vleis further up on the escarpment, through which the Umgeni River trickles, having risen from a spring at the very top of a koppie on the farm, called the Drinkkop. Dad had arranged for a friend, another farmer, who owned a trout hatchery in Underberg, a 20-minute light aircraft flight away, to deliver our first batch of fish in order to boost the population of the existing indigenous brown trout. On one of the weekends we were up there, the man flew his 4-seater Cessna low over the almost full lake and had his labourer tip 10,000 fingerlings, 3-week-old rainbow trout hatchlings, out of 44-gallon drums on the plain down into the dam. These grew to a remarkable size within the 2 years it took to fill the vlei and form Lake Lyndhurst, and were already fat, bright pink, and some well over 5 pounds in size. They put up a very satisfying fight, especially when we trolled, by cruising very slowly around the dam in Dad's dinghy with the 4-stroke outboard on its lowest throttle, trailing our flies in the water. Dad had cogitated for a long time before allowing trolling as a legitimate way of fishing, but the rest of his strict rules for engine size, boat length, and fishing methods had to be followed. This was a gentleman's sport. About 10 years, Mum held the record for catching the biggest trout, over 10 pounds, using that method. Robin, my brother-in-law, who'd lent us the paraphernalia to go to Mozambique, had caught some whoppers too, but had to keep them a secret, hiding the fact that he'd tied large, juicy, still kicking grasshoppers to strong 100-pound breaking strain sea fishing lines, and then trolled them behind his own boat. Every time I saw your dad's bucky come over the horizon, I had to chuck the bloody things back in case he asked me what fly I'd used. And I never remembered to have one on me, just that tin of grasshoppers, he chuckled. Fred decided that trolling was cheating and preferred to walk along the bank in the long summer grass, casting out every now and then. But I noticed that whenever I wanted to use the boat to get to the best places to fish, he wasn't above dragging one of his homemade flies along behind the boat as well, saying, well, as long as we're just getting from one place to another, I reckon it's legitimate. Months passed by in this pleasant manner. We both worked hard at our jobs. We loved our little home in the suburbs, with the odd weekend up in the refreshing, champagne-like cool air of the mountains at New Forest, and I learnt all the best ways to cook trout, among other delicacies. Fred received a long, smeared, scrawled airmail letter every fortnight from Bar. Clearly, most of it had been written after she'd been at the whiskey. We also got a weekly phone call from her, or rather Fred did. I learnt the time of evening and which day she tended to ring, and left him to pick up. He never said much, but I could hear her broad, rasping American or Scottish accent, depending on whether they were in Florida at La Rochelle or Glen Cruton in Scotland, squawking loudly as he held the receiver well away from his ear, wincing now and again. He never looked happy after her calls. Her letters, which he handed to me after puzzling over them himself, made very little sense either. They were scrawled in bar speak, phrases such as, I've just climbed off the Puff to GC, which meant she'd caught the overnight sleeper train from their flat in London to travel up to Crianlarich, where Johnny, their general factotum, and Gilly collected her and drove her up to Glen Cruton. The roadies are all out, meaning the rhododendrons were in bloom, and other such utterly unintelligible and meaningless nonsense. There did seem to be some sort of urgency that I didn't understand. Neither did Fred. It was something to do with all too much for me to cope with now, darling. These two huge places, and Bob's not getting any younger. His knees are playing up again. Once we'd deciphered her bar speak, we took very little notice of all this histrionic-sounding stuff. Mummy loves to make a drama out of everything, remarked Fred dryly, especially after a few drams. And we carried on serenely, following the comfortable constancy of the daily, weekly, and then monthly pattern of our pleasant routine. Fred had a few quirks, which one of which was his comically Scottish, canny way about spending money. He was the only person I'd ever heard of who bought tickets to the policeman's ball and actually attended it. The South African police are predominantly Afrikaners, Boers, I tried to explain. They're nothing like your British bobbies, and their minds work entirely differently. Okay, we're white, but we're also English speaking, and there's no telling how or even if they'll accept us. You know how the Boers hate us. They're convinced that we're all subversive liberals and just waiting to encourage a black uprising. We're not wasting these tickets, babe. They cost me R2 each, he said firmly, and off we went to the City Hall. He donned the dinner jacket he'd been carting around with him since he'd left the UK, and, with some misgiving, I'd put on my most formal long dress. We arrived in the massive Victorian Durban City Hall to stand around self-consciously in a vast echoing ballroom among a large crowd of massively built, overdressed men, most of whom wore frilly tuxedos with wide and colourful cummerbunds straining over their boops, and watched them steering their big-boned, buxom wives around the dance floor to a waltz played rather vigorously by an enthusiastic but less than skillful boeremusiek Oompa-type band. Some of the wives were bulging out of tightly sheathed frocks in garishly brightly coloured shiny satin to match their husbands' cummerbunds and glittering with sequins. All my mother's worst nightmares come to life. We received the odd, curious glance, and now and again we'd get a slight nod of puzzled greeting from one of the men. It was glaringly apparent we weren't members of the Broederbond, the Afrikaner version of the Nazi SS squad. After we'd been introduced to the mayor of Durban, we had a quick supper from the buffet and surreptitiously slipped away. Once we were safely out of ear and gunshot, we both burst into doubled-up laughter at the bottom of the City Hall steps and went home. Diane announced that she and John were to have a baby and was 3 months into her pregnancy. We were all pleased for her, and I fell into the routine of either ringing her once a week if she wasn't suffering too much from morning sickness, or we'd pop up to the farm when they came down to visit Mum and Dad, as they often did. Although she did suffer from nausea for the first few months, she took on a healthy bloom and began to grow a neat bump. I rather envied all the fuss and attention that John lavished on her, and even Mum and Dad showed an interest, telling her to put her feet up and rest after the long drive down to the farm from Joburg. Mum knitted little jerseys and booties, and even old Gran joined in. Mum's mother now lived in an old age home in Port Elizabeth after Grandpa Southey had died long ago in about 1960, not long before Grandpa Fort had passed away as well. Sadly, because Gran had never learned to drive, She sold their lovely little house on that jewel of a place, Leisure Isle, in the Knysna Lagoon. It was a great pity that Dad hadn't advised Mum and Gran a little better, rented out the house to pay for her care home upkeep and keep the property, as Leisure Isle has become the most sought after real estate in South Africa. And Grandpa's modest half-acre plot, not counting their little house, would have sold for many millions later on. We had all loved the house and the lifestyle Grandpa Southey had lived, collecting bait at low tide in the salt marshes, and then setting off in his small rowing boat to catch whatever surprises the lagoon presented at high tide. When we went down there for family holidays, like Grandpa Fort had, he swept the four of us up to join in whatever he was doing, guiding us carefully and nurturing a lifetime's enthusiasm for collecting bait and, in my case, estuary fishing. Gran knitted baby booties the same size as she knitted Dad's socks when he was in the army, and we all laughed when the lumpy parcels arrived at the farm, wrapped in crumpled used brown paper and carefully scrimped string. Diana's baby was due in mid-December, and the more I saw her blossom and enjoy the extra attention, the more I envied her. I celebrated a demure 21st birthday by holding a Saturday evening braai for our closest friends in our garden in January 1971. Round about July 1971, during the best month of all in Durban, when the days are warm and free of any humidity, and the nights are chilly but not frosty, I broached the subject of having our own baby to Fred. By then Diana was due in 5 months, and it seemed more and more to me like a nice idea to have a cousin for it nearly the same age. I don't really want to slave away at the chartered accountants for 90 Rand a month forever. But I said, but actually it wasn't the commute rather than the job I found so tiring. But actually it was the commute rather than the job I found so tiring. Sitting at my big receptionist's desk in the smart glass and chrome foyer in an air-conditioned office, managing a 6-line switchboard and a few difficult but mostly pleasant clients and bosses, wasn't at all taxing. It was jinking in and out of the heavy traffic, dodging a new menace, the high ace, the Japanese minibus, which had caught on like wildfire all over South Africa. They were used as taxis, and although they were licensed to carry 16 Japanese passengers, they were always, without exception, overloaded with sometimes up to 25 African passengers, who were mainly large women, like my old nanny Evelina. These usually unroadworthy vehicles, crammed with big and heavy people, plus all their izimpahla, parcels and bags, went careering all over the place at top speed, jamming on their brakes with no warning to pick up passengers at random. Basically, anyone who flagged them down vigorously from any roadside, even the main dual carriageways. They zoomed past on my blind side, swerved suddenly back into my lane, going way over the speed limits and frightening the life out of me. One Friday night, always the worst day for rush hour traffic, I'd had such a narrow escape that I drove crossly down the next morning to an Indian-run car parts scrapyard on the South Coast Road. There I bought a massive hooter that had come off a scrapped green Mamba bus. I had them install it for me and blasted away furiously at the taxis with it, which seemed only to encourage them to hoot back just as loudly and spurred them on to greater efforts to kill me. My route was also the main artery from Umlazi, Durban's and now South Africa's biggest African township. And my tiny Mini was fair game for Zulu taxi drivers, very few of whom were literate enough to have taken their driver's tests. There was a brisk trade, though, in forged driving licenses, and this had made all our roads extremely hazardous. The worst part of all was that, to a Zulu, to give way is a sign of weakness, so they'd forge on through red lights and four-way stops at top speed. The road death rate rocketed the minute those taxis arrived in the country, and has continued to be the major cause of all deaths among South Africans of all races ever since. I began to dread my twice-daily ordeal of this death trap drive, and told Fred how worrying and exhausting I was finding the commute. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week. And thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.